When Kate Middleton watched Prince William answer that phone call at Kensington Palace, she knew instantly something had shattered. A year after Queen Elizabeth's death, palace officials had discovered a hidden letter, sealed and marked, "To be opened upon my death," regarding the Duchess of Cornwall. For decades, the Queen had frozen Camilla out with polite coldness, never granting her the recognition she desperately sought. The royal family had accepted this as permanent. Camilla would never be queen. But as William, Kate, and King Charles gathered at Clarence House to break the seal, Elizabeth's words from beyond the grave would detonate everything they thought they knew. The late Queen hadn't written to punish Camilla. She'd written to finally set her free, and the directive was absolute. Camilla would be Queen Consort, without hesitation, without apology. The coronation was about to change everything. The morning began the way most mornings did at Kensington Palace, with the cheerful chaos of children and the mundane rituals of breakfast. Kate stood at the kitchen counter, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, pouring orange juice into 3 mismatched glasses, while Charlotte argued with Louis about whose turn it was to choose the cereal. George sat at the table with his homework spread before him, chewing thoughtfully on his pencil, his brow furrowed in concentration that made him look startlingly like his father. "Mom, tell Louis it's my turn," Charlotte insisted, her voice rising with that particular brand of indignation only an 8-year-old could muster. "It's always your turn," Louis shot back, clutching the box of Cheerios to his chest like treasure. Kate turned, opening her mouth to mediate, when she heard the distant ring of William's mobile from upstairs. Nothing unusual in that calls came at all hours, some routine, some urgent, all demanding attention in their own way. But something in the quality of the silence that followed made her pause, juice carton still suspended in midair. Upstairs, in the study that overlooked the garden, William had been reviewing briefing papers for an upcoming engagement when his phone lit up with a number he recognized immediately: Buckingham Palace. Not his father's private line, not his grandmother's old number, which still appeared in his contacts like a ghost he couldn't bring himself to delete. This was the main switchboard, formal and official. "William Cambridge," he answered, his voice automatically shifting into the clipped professional tone he'd inherited along with his title. "Your Royal Highness, this is Sir Michael Hargreaves, His Majesty's private secretary. I apologize for the early call, but something has come to our attention that requires immediate discussion." William's chest tightened. "Is my father all right?" "His Majesty is well, sir. This concerns a discovery made during the cataloging of Her late Majesty's private papers. A letter, sir, sealed and pen marked for His Majesty's eyes. We felt you should be informed immediately." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Private papers. A year after her death, they were still finding pieces of her, instructions from beyond the grave, carefully planted seeds that would bloom in her absence. What kind of letter? There was a pause, weighted with significance. "The envelope is marked, 'To be opened upon my death,' regarding the Duchess of Cornwall." William's hand tightened around the phone. Camilla. Of course it was about Camilla. Even now, even gone, his grandmother was still orchestrating, still managing the impossible complexity of love and duty and public opinion that had defined so much of her reign. "Has my father seen it?" "Not yet, sir. Given the sensitive nature, we thought it best to inform you first. His Majesty has requested your presence at Clarence House this morning, if you're available, along with the Duchess of Cambridge, if she's willing." William's gaze drifted to the Fremantle window, to the garden where his children had played just yesterday, their laughter rising like music through the autumn air. "We'll be there within the hour." When he ended the call, he sat for a long moment in the stillness of his study, surrounded by the trappings of his life, photographs of his children, his wedding portrait, a framed picture of his grandmother at her coronation, young and radiant and impossibly far away. Why now? Why hidden? His grandmother had never done anything without reason. without careful calculation of consequence and timing. If she'd left this letter to be found now, a year after her death, it meant something. It meant everything. He descended the stairs slowly, each step a deliberate delay of the inevitable moment when he would have to put this uncertainty into words. The sounds of the kitchen grew louder, Charlotte's voice, Louis's giggle, the clink of spoons against bowls. Normal sounds, safe sounds. The architecture of an ordinary morning that was about to shift into something else entirely. Kate saw him first. She always did. She was reaching for the milk when she caught sight of him in the doorway, and her hand froze mid-reach. Her eyes, those steady, perceptive eyes that had learned to read him over years of practice, registered something in his face that made her straighten immediately. "Kids, go wash your hands," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We haven't finished breakfast," Charlotte protested. "Now, please." Something in her tone silenced further argument. George gathered his homework without being asked, shepherding his younger siblings toward the hallway with the instinctive understanding of a child who'd learned early to read the emotional temperature of a room. At the doorway, he glanced back at his parents. His eyes, so much older than 11 years, should allow lingering on his father's face before he disappeared down the corridor. Kate crossed to William, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. "What happened?" "They found a letter. My grandmother's. About Camilla." Kate's breath caught, barely perceptible. "What does it say?" "No one knows. It's sealed. Addressed to my father, marked to be opened after her death." William's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. "We're expected at Clarence House." Kate reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his, warm and certain. "Then we should go." The Range Rover slipped through the streets of London with the practiced ease of a vehicle that made this journey often. Though today the familiar route felt different. Each landmark, a marker on a path towards something unknown. William drove with his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but Kate could see the tension in his jaw, the way his gaze would drift for just a moment before snapping back to focus. She waited. They'd been together long enough for her to know when to speak and when to simply be present, an anchor in the silence. Finally, as they turned onto the mall, the palace, visible in the distance, William spoke. "What do you think it says?" Kate considered this carefully. "I think your grandmother was deliberate. She always was." "That's not an answer." "No," Kate agreed softly. "But it's the truth. She never did anything without reason." William's hands tightened on the wheel. She was cold to Camilla. For years. You remember at family gatherings, the way she'd greet her with that polite distance, like she was tolerating rather than accepting. And the whole question of the title, whether Camilla would be queen consort or princess consort, she kept it ambiguous right up until the end. She was also the queen, Kate reminded him. She had to balance what she felt personally with what she believed the country needed. That couldn't have been easy. So, which was this letter? William's voice carried an edge of something raw. Personal feeling or public duty? Kate looked out the window at the passing city tourists gathering at the palace gates, businessmen hurrying to meetings, a mother pushing a pram along the pavement, all of them going about their lives with no idea that somewhere in this labyrinth of power and protocol, a dead queen was still moving pieces on a chessboard only she could see. "Maybe," Kate said slowly, "it was both." William's mind drifted backward, unbidden, to those final months before his grandmother's death. He'd visited her at Windsor, found her in her sitting room surrounded by papers and photographs, organizing her life with the same methodical precision she'd brought to 70 years of service. She'd looked up at him with those sharp blue eyes, still brilliant despite her age, and said something that had struck him as odd at the time. "I've left instructions, William, for after. Some things are easier said in writing than in person." He'd thought she meant funeral arrangements, the succession, the 1,000 practical details that came with the death of a monarch. It hadn't occurred to him that she might mean something more personal, more complicated. Something about forgiveness, perhaps. or permission. The streets grew more familiar as they approached Clarence House, the high walls, the security gates, the discreet presence of protection officers who melted into the background until needed. William had grown up with this architecture of privacy, this careful construction of normalcy within abnormality. But today, it all felt different, charged with significance. As they turned into the drive, Kate touched his arm. "Whatever it says, we'll deal with it together. What if it changes everything?" Kate's voice was steady. "Then it changes everything. But you won't be alone in it." Clarence House rose before them, elegant and imposing in the morning light. At the entrance, a figure stood waiting Charles, dressed in a suit but without his usual polish, his tie slightly askew, his expression unreadable. In his hand, he held a cream-colored envelope, sealed with red wax that bore the unmistakable impression of his mother's private seal. William pulled the car to a stop, but for a moment, neither he nor Kate moved. They sat in the suspended reality of the moment before, when the letter was still unopened, and its contents still existed in the realm of possibility rather than fact. Then Kate opened her door, and the moment broke. William followed, his legs carrying him forward on autopilot, trained by years of duty to walk into uncertainty with his head held high. Charles watched them approach, and in his eyes, William saw something he rarely witnessed in his father: naked vulnerability. "Thank you for coming," Charles said, his voice rough. "I didn't want to open it alone." Charles's private sitting room had always felt like a sanctuary to William, warm where other royal rooms were grand, comfortable where they were formal. Books lined the walls. Art that Charles had personally chosen, rather than inherited, hung in careful arrangement. And through the tall windows, the garden spread in ordered beauty. But today the room felt too small, the air too thick, as if the three of them had displaced all the oxygen simply by gathering here. They sat in a triangle of sorts, Charles in his usual chair by the fireplace, William and Kate together on the sofa opposite. The envelope lay on the coffee table between them like an accusation, like a promise, like a bridge between the past and whatever came next. For a long moment, no one moved to touch it. "I thought I knew everything she wanted to say," Charles finally spoke, his eyes fixed on the envelope. "We had time, at the end. Time to talk about the transition, about my role, about what kind of king she hoped I'd be. But this," he gestured helplessly. "Why leave this for after? Why not just tell me?" "Because some things are easier to hear when the person who says them can't be argued with," Kate suggested gently. Charles looked at her with something like gratitude, then reached for the envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal, not from age, but from emotion barely contained. The wax crumbled, red fragments falling onto the polished wood of the table like drops of blood. Inside, the paper was thick and cream-colored, the handwriting instantly recognizable. William had seen his grandmother's hand on countless birthday cards, Christmas messages, the occasional personal note tucked into official correspondence. But this was different. The letters were still precise, still elegantly formed, but there was something in the weight of the ink on the page that spoke of importance, of finality. Charles's voice, when he began to read, was barely above a whisper. "My dearest Charles, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are king. I pray that the transition has been smooth, that the country has accepted what they must, and that you are not too burdened by the weight of the crown that now sits upon your head. But I know you, my son. I know that you will carry burdens, whether they are placed upon you or whether you seek them out yourself. It is your nature, both your greatest strength and your most dangerous weakness. I write this regarding Camilla, because there are things I need to say that I could not say while I lived. Constrained as I was by duty, by public opinion, by the memory of Diana, and the wound her death left in the nation's heart, I was not always kind to Camilla. I was not always fair. I kept her at arm's length, made her wait, withheld from her the recognition she deserved, not because she had not earned it, but because I feared the reaction of a nation still healing, still holding on to its grief. Charles' voice cracked slightly. He paused, swallowed, continued. But let me be clear now. In a way I could not be then. Camilla has earned her place at your side. She has stood by you through decades of scrutiny and judgment, has borne the weight of public disapproval with grace, has made you happy in a way I always hoped you would be but feared you never would. She has been loyal, steadfast, and devoted not to the institution, though she has served it well, but to you. And that, perhaps, is worth more than any official endorsement I could have given. Upon my death, it is my wish, and my directive, that Camilla be known as Queen Consort, without hesitation or qualification. She has waited long enough. Charles, you must not ask permission. You must not equivocate or defer, or allow others to diminish what she has become to you, to this family, to the crown. You must simply do what is right. The silence that followed was absolute. William could hear his own heartbeat, the distant tick of a clock on the mantel, Kate's careful breathing beside him. Charles had stopped reading, his eyes still on the page but unseeing now, tears tracking slowly down his cheeks. But there was more. Charles drew a shaking breath and continued. To William and Catherine, for I know my son will have you present for this. Unable as he is to bear important moments alone, you will understand one day what it means to put duty before desire. You are already learning it, I think, in small ways and large. But you will also learn that sometimes love must be allowed to exist alongside duty. They are not enemies, though they often seem to be. They are not mutually exclusive, though the institution would have you believe otherwise. Do not let my mistakes become yours. Do not let the crown make you cold. Do not let duty hollow you out until there is nothing left but obligation. Find the balance I sought for 70 years and never quite achieved. And when you fail, for you will fail. As all of us do, forgive yourselves. As I have learned, too late to forgive myself. With all my love, and all my hope for your future, Elizabeth R. The letter ended there, but its presence filled the room, like a fourth person, like a ghost made manifest. Charles set the paper down with trembling hands, and covered his face, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. William moved without thinking, crossing the space between them, kneeling beside his father's chair, the way he had as a child when the world had felt too big and frightening to face alone. Kate stayed where she was, but her hand found William's shoulder, a touch that grounded him even as his own eyes burned with unshed tears. She gave you permission, William said, his voice rough with emotion. She gave you her blessing. She waited until she was gone to do it, Charles managed. Even this, she couldn't give me while she lived. No, Kate spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. She couldn't give it publicly while she lived. But she made sure you'd have it when you needed it most, when the world would be watching, waiting to see if you'd falter. She gave you her words as armor. Charles looked up at her, his face ravaged by emotion but also by something else, something that looked almost like relief, like vindication, like the lifting of a burden he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. What do I do now? He asked. And in that moment, he wasn't a king asking a subject. He was a father asking a son, a man asking another man, who understood the impossible complexity of loving someone the world wouldn't let you love in peace. William's hand tightened on his father's arm. You do what she said. You do what's right. And Kate, watching them both, felt the weight of the letter settle not just on Charles, but on all of them, a legacy of duty and love, of sacrifice and permission, of an old queen trying, in death, to teach them how to live. The drive back to Kensington Palace passed in a kind of suspended reality, as though they were moving through water rather than air, everything muted and slow. William's hands rested on the steering wheel with deceptive casualness, But Kate could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw worked silently as he navigated through traffic that seemed both too thick and too distant to matter. She didn't try to fill the silence. There were things that needed to settle first, emotions that had to find their shape before they could be named. The letter sat between them like a third passenger, invisible but impossible to ignore. Her voice, Elizabeth's voice, reaching across death to rearrange the furniture of their understanding. By the time they pulled through the gates of Kensington Palace, the afternoon had softened into something gentler, the light turning golden as it slanted through the trees. The children would be having their tea by now, supervised by their nanny, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath their family had shifted in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. William parked, but didn't immediately move to exit. He sat with his hands still on the wheel, staring at nothing, and Kate waited. She'd learned long ago that he needed these moments, small pockets of stillness, before he could face what came next. She kept it hidden, he finally said, his voice quiet. All those years, all those family gatherings where she barely looked at Camilla, where you could feel the coldness radiating from her. And she had this written the whole time? Kate unbuckled her seatbelt and turned to face him. We don't know when she wrote it. It could have been recently. At the end. Does that make it better? William's eyes finally met hers, and she saw in them something she recognized: the struggle to reconcile two different versions of the same person. Does it matter if she felt this way for decades and never said it, or if she only came to it when she was dying? Yes, Kate said simply. I think it does matter. Because if it was recent, it means she changed. It means she learned something, even at the end. And that's not nothing, William. He exhaled slowly, then reached for the door handle. They walked into the palace together, their footsteps echoing on the polished floors, past the portraits of ancestors who'd faced their own impossible choices, their own conflicts between heart and crown. The sounds of the children drifted from the kitchen, Louis's laughter, Charlotte's voice raised in some passionate argument, George's quieter tones trying to mediate. We should talk, Kate said softly, before we see them. William nodded, and they climbed the stairs to their private quarters, that sanctuary within a sanctuary, where they could, for brief moments, be simply William and Kate, rather than the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, the future king and queen consort. The titles waited like coats by the door, ready to be shrugged back on, but here, in this room, they could take them off. Kate closed the door behind them, and the sounds of the palace, the distant voices, the footsteps, the telephone ringing somewhere below, faded to background noise. William stood by the window, his back to her, looking out over the gardens where dusk was beginning to gather in the corners. She was protecting her, in the end, Kate said, coming to stand beside him, or protecting the monarchy from itself. William's reflection in the glass looked tired, older than his years. Protecting the institution from the accusation that it's incapable of change, that it will always sacrifice people for the sake of appearance. Kate considered this, watching the way the fading light caught in the trees, turned the leaves to gold and copper. Can't it be both? I suppose it can. William turned from the window, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration she knew well. But which was more important to her? Camilla's happiness? Or the crown's reputation? Does it matter? Kate asked gently. The result is the same. She gave Camilla her blessing. She gave your father permission to stop apologizing for who he loves. It matters because... William paused, searching for words. Because I need to understand her. I need to know if she was the cold, dutiful queen who put the institution above everything, or if she was a woman who wanted to be kinder but couldn't find a way to do it while she was alive. I need to know which one George will have to be. And there it was, the fear that had been coiling beneath everything else. Not about Camilla. Not really. About what this letter meant for the future, for the unwritten rules they'd all been raised to follow, for the kind of king their son would have to become. Kate took his hand, held it between both of hers. Your grandmother spent 70 years on the throne. 70 years of putting duty first, of sacrificing personal feeling for public stability. And at the end, she wrote this letter. What does that tell you? That she had regrets? That she learned? Kate corrected softly. That even after 70 years, she was still learning. And she wanted to pass that lesson on, not just to your father, but to us, to George. She said it herself. Don't let my mistakes become yours. William pulled away, pacing to the other side of the room. But what does that mean, practically? What does it look like to balance love and duty when they're pulling in opposite directions? She never managed it. My father certainly hasn't. How am I supposed to teach George to do something I don't even understand myself? You teach him by trying, Kate said. By making mistakes and learning from them. By being honest about how hard it is, instead of pretending it's simple. He's 11 years old. He shouldn't have to think about any of this yet. But he does think about it. You know he does. He sees things, William. He understands more than we give him credit for. William sank into the chair by the fireplace, his head in his hands. When I was his age, my mother had just died. I spent the next decade trying to figure out how to be angry at her for leaving, and angry at the institution for driving her away, and loyal to my father and protective of my brother all at the same time. I don't want that for George. I don't want him torn between competing loyalties before he's old enough to understand what loyalty even means. Kate crossed to him, knelt beside the chair the way he'd knelt beside his father earlier. Then we teach him something your grandmother couldn't quite manage, and your father is still learning. We teach him that loving someone and serving the crown don't have to be at war with each other. That being human doesn't make you a bad king, it might make you a better one. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple, it's impossibly hard. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. She waited until he looked at her. What did you feel when you heard that letter? When your grandmother wrote about Camilla earning her place? About love existing alongside duty? William was quiet for a long moment. Relief, he finally admitted. That maybe we don't all have to be as alone as she was. Kate rose and moved to the window, her silhouette framed by the dying light. She reached for the curtains, which had been half drawn to keep out the afternoon sun, and pulled them fully open. The last rays of daylight flooded the room, warm and golden, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. We can't live in the shadows of her decisions forever, Kate said, her voice quiet but certain. We can honor them, learn from them, but we can't be bound by them. She knew that. That's why she wrote what she wrote. William joined her at the window, and together they looked out at the gardens, at the city beyond, at the world they would one day be called upon to serve in ways neither of them could fully predict. The weight of it was still there, it would always be there, but somehow, in the fading light, it felt less crushing. I should call my father, William said. Make sure he's all right. In a moment. Kate leaned into him, and his arm came around her automatically. First, just stand here with me. Just be here. Now. Before we have to be anything else. So they stood. In the golden light, two people trying to figure out how to be both human and royal. How to love and serve. How to prepare their children for a future that demanded everything, while hoping they could hold on to something essential along the way. Outside, the light continued to fade, but inside, something else was taking shape. Not certainty, but perhaps something better. Understanding, permission, the possibility of a different way forward. 2 days later, they returned to Clarence House for dinner, and the very air felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but charged with a kind of careful hopefulness, as though everyone was testing the weight of words that had been spoken, and trying to determine what they could build on such a foundation. The dinner itself began with the usual formality: uniformed staff serving courses with practiced efficiency, conversation that touched on safe topics, George's progress at school, an upcoming engagement in Scotland, the unseasonably warm weather. But, beneath the practiced normalcy, there was a current of something unspoken, waiting. Camilla looked smaller somehow, her usual composure slightly fractured. She ate little, her fork moving food around her plate, in distracted patterns. Charles kept glancing at her, with barely concealed concern, his own meal forgotten. William and Kate maintained the flow of conversation, filling the silences with the social grace they'd both perfected over years of practice. But even that felt like a holding pattern, a circling around the thing they'd all come here to address. It was only when the staff had cleared the main course and left them alone with strict instructions not to be disturbed that the carefully constructed normalcy began to crack. Charles set down his wine glass with more force than necessary, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "I want to thank you both," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "for the other morning, for being there. I couldn't have." He paused, swallowed. "I couldn't have read that alone." "You shouldn't have had to," William replied. "No. Well." Charles attempted a smile that didn't quite land. "Your grandmother had a gift for timing, even in death. She always knew exactly when to twist the knife or offer the olive branch." "Charles," Camilla said softly, the first word she'd spoken since they'd sat down to eat. "It's true, darling. You know it is." He turned to William and Kate, and in his eyes was something raw, undefended. "I'd made peace with it, you know. With Camilla never being fully accepted, with her always being provisional. The wife, but not quite the queen. I thought that was the price we'd pay for our choices, and I was willing to pay it. She was willing to pay it." "You shouldn't have had to," Kate said, echoing William's words, but with a different emphasis. "But we did. For decades." Charles's hand found Camilla's on the table, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "Your grandmother was never cruel, not overtly, but she is distant. Correct? But cold. At family gatherings, she'd greet Camilla politely and then turn away, as if eye contact for too long might constitute an endorsement she wasn't prepared to give. Camilla had been silent through this, her gaze fixed on their joined hands, but now she looked up, and William saw in her face something he'd never quite seen before. Not vulnerability, exactly, but a kind of tired honesty that came from decades of holding oneself very carefully together. "I understood," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I knew what I was to the public. The other woman, the one who ruined the fairy tale. I knew that every time I appeared beside Charles, there were people who thought of Diana, who felt I was taking something that should never have been mine. And the queen, she had to think of those people. She had to manage their grief, their anger. I was the acceptable sacrifice." Camilla, Charles started, but she gently squeezed his hand. "Let me finish, darling. I need to say this." She looked at William then, directly, and he forced himself to hold her gaze, even though part of him wanted to look away. "I never asked for the title. I never demanded recognition. I just wanted to be with your father, and I was willing to do that on whatever terms were offered. But to know that she," her voice wavered, "to know that she thought I'd earned it, that she believed I'd waited long enough, it changes something. I can't quite name what, but it changes something." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion barely contained. William felt Kate's hand find his under the table, her touch a reminder that he wasn't in this alone, that whatever he said next, he didn't have to bear the weight of it by himself. "I had reservations," William said slowly, forcing the words out. "For years, it wasn't about you personally, not entirely. It was about loyalty to my mother's memory, about feeling like accepting you meant somehow betraying her. I know that's not fair. I know my mother and father's marriage was complicated. But grief isn't logical, and neither is loyalty." Camilla's eyes glistened. "I know, but you've been steady," William continued. "For my father, yes, but also for us, for the family. You've shown up even when it must have been painful, even when you knew you weren't wanted or welcomed by everyone. And my grandmother saw that. In the end, she saw it. She also saw that the institution needed to change, Kate added, her voice gentle but firm. Her letter wasn't just about Camilla. It was about all of us, about permission to be human within a system that's designed to strip away humanity in the name of duty. She was telling us, telling you, Charles, that you don't have to make the same sacrifices she did. That maybe there's a different way. Charles' composure, which had been holding by threads, finally broke. His shoulders shook with silent sobs, his free hand covering his face. Camilla leaned into him, her own tears falling quietly. And for a moment, William and Kate simply witnessed their grief, their relief, their complicated tangle of emotions that came from decades of waiting for permission they'd almost stopped believing would ever come. "I'm terrified," Charles said finally, his voice muffled, "of being king, of failing, of not living up to 70 years of her service. She made it look effortless, but I know it wasn't. I know what it cost her. And I'm terrified I don't have what it takes." William rose from his seat and moved around the table, kneeling beside his father's chair in a mirror of the moment 2 days before. "You won't be alone," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "We'll face it together. All of us." Charles looked at his son, and in his eyes was a mixture of gratitude and something else. A recognition, perhaps, that they were building something different here, something that might not have been possible in his mother's generation. "Together," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Together," Kate confirmed from across the table. And Camilla, who had spent so many years on the periphery, who had learned to make herself small and unobtrusive and easy to overlook, allowed herself to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be, in this moment at least, enough. They sat together as the evening deepened outside the windows, the formal dinner abandoned, the remains of the meal growing cold. They talked about the letter, about Elizabeth, about what came next. They didn't solve anything. There were no easy answers to questions that had plagued their family for decades. But they sat together in the complexity of it, and somehow that was enough. When William and Kate finally left, near midnight, Charles walked them to the door. "Your grandmother would have approved of tonight," he said, "of us actually talking instead of maintaining polite fictions." "I think she would have," William agreed. "I think maybe that's what she was trying to teach us all along, that we're stronger when we stop pretending to be perfect." Charles embraced his son, holding him tightly for a long moment. "Thank you," he whispered, "for seeing Camilla, for giving her a chance. Thank you for being brave enough to love her," William replied, even when it was impossible. The house was quiet when they returned to Kensington Palace, the kind of stillness that only came after children had been put to bed, and the day's chaos had finally settled into something resembling peace. William and Kate climbed the stairs together, exhausted but also strangely lighter, as if the evening's conversation had released something that had been held too tightly for too long. They were nearly to their own bedroom when they heard it, the low murmur of voices coming from George's room. Not arguing, not playing, but talking in that serious way children sometimes did when they were trying to puzzle out the adult world they'd been born into but didn't quite understand. William and Kate exchanged a glance, and without needing to discuss it, they changed direction. William knocked softly on George's door before opening it. All 3 children were there. George sat on his bed, still dressed in his pajamas but clearly too wired to sleep. Charlotte had curled up beside him, her knees drawn to her chest in a way that made her look younger than her 8 years. And Louis, who should have been fast asleep hours ago, sat cross-legged on the floor, his favorite stuffed dog clutched in his arms. They looked up as their parents entered, and the guilt on their faces was so transparent it might have been comical under different circumstances. "We weren't eavesdropping," Charlotte said immediately. "Not really. We just heard you and Daddy talking," George added, "about Great-Granny, and Grandpa, and Camilla." William felt Kate's hand on his back, a gentle pressure that meant, this is the moment, this is when we choose how honest to be. He moved into the room, and, after a brief hesitation, sat down on the floor beside Louis. Kate followed, settling next to him, and suddenly they were all at the same level. No parents looming over children, no hierarchy of age or knowledge, just a family trying to navigate something complicated together. "What did you hear?" William asked gently. George bit his lip, considering. Not everything, but enough to know that Great-Granny left a letter about Camilla, about her being queen. He looked at his father with those two old eyes. Why is everyone talking about it like it's a surprise? William took a breath, choosing his words carefully. Because Great-Granny didn't tell anyone she'd written it while she was alive. She left it to be found after she was gone. And in it, she said some things that people weren't expecting. Like what? Charlotte asked, her voice small. Like that Camilla should be called queen, Kate said softly. Just like Grandpa is. Called king. Not princess consort or duchess, but queen. And that it was what Great-Granny wanted, even though she never said it out loud while she was here. But I thought only real queens were called queen? Charlotte's voice held confusion, and something else, a child's need for the world to make sense, according to the rules she'd been taught. Kate smiled gently. She is a real queen, darling. Sometimes it just takes time for people to see it. Sometimes people have to change their minds about what they thought they knew. Louis, who had been quiet through this exchange, suddenly spoke up. Did Great-Granny send the letter from heaven? The innocence of the question hit William like a physical blow. He reached out and pulled his youngest son onto his lap, holding him close. In a way, yes, he said, his voice tender. She wrote it before she went to heaven, but she made sure we wouldn't find it until after. So it feels a little bit like she's still talking to us, still teaching us things. George had been watching his father's face throughout this exchange, reading the emotions that flickered there with the perceptiveness that both worried and impressed William. Will people be angry? He asked quietly. About Camilla being queen? And there it was, the question that cut to the heart of everything. William could lie, could soften it, could tell his son that everything would be fine and no one would object. But he'd promised himself, after his own childhood of half-truths and protective deceptions, that he would be honest with his children about the world they were inheriting. Some might be, William said. Some people still remember your grandmother Diana, and they loved her very much. They might feel like calling Camilla queen is somehow disrespectful to Diana's memory. Other people might just not like change. They got used to things being one way, and now they have to adjust. But that's not fair to Camilla, George said, a note of indignation in his voice. No, it's not. But fairness doesn't always matter when it comes to public opinion. What matters is doing what you believe is right, even when it's hard, even when people disagree. George absorbed this, his young face serious. Is that what Great-Granny was trying to teach Grandpa? To be brave? I think so. Great-Granny believed it was the right thing to do. And sometimes doing the right thing means being brave, even when it's hard. Even when you know some people won't understand or agree. Charlotte had been quiet, processing, but now she spoke up. Daddy, do you think it's the right thing? William looked at his daughter, at the earnest concern in her eyes, and felt the weight of the question. She wasn't just asking about Camilla. She was asking him to define his values, to show her what kind of man he was, what kind of king he hoped to be. I think, he said slowly, that Camilla has been part of our family for a long time. She's made Grandpa happy. She's been kind to all of you. And she's never asked for anything except to be allowed to be with the person she loves. So yes, I think she's earned the right to be called queen. And I think Great-Granny knew that, even if it took her a long time to say it. George had moved to the window while his father spoke, drawn by something outside, or perhaps by the need to process this information while looking at something familiar and unchanging. He stood there now, small in his pajamas, looking out at the London skyline that glittered in the darkness. at the city that would one day be his responsibility in ways that no 11-year-old should have to contemplate. Kate rose and moved to him, placing her hands on his shoulders. She felt the tension there, the weight already settling onto bones that were still growing, still soft enough to be shaped by the burdens placed upon them. "It's a lot, isn't it?" she said softly. "All of this, the history, and the rules, and the expectations." George nodded, not trusting his voice. "You don't have to carry it alone," Kate whispered, leaning down so only he could hear. "Your father didn't carry it alone, and his father didn't, and great-granny didn't, even though sometimes it seemed like she did. We're all here. We'll all help you carry it when it gets too heavy." George turned to look at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "What if I'm not brave enough? What if I can't do what great-granny did?" "You don't have to do what she did," Kate said firmly. "You just have to do what you can do, the best way you know how. And you'll make mistakes, and you'll learn from them, and you'll keep trying. That's all anyone can ask." William had joined them at the window, Charlotte and Louis trailing behind. And suddenly they were all there together, looking out at the city that represented both their duty and their prison, their privilege and their burden. "Are you scared, Daddy?" Louis asked, his voice muffled against William's leg. William picked him up, settling to him on his hip, even though Louis was really getting too big for it. "Sometimes," he admitted, "sometimes I'm very scared. Of making the wrong choice, of letting people down, of not being good enough. But you do it anyway," George said. "Not a question but a statement. But I do it anyway. Because being scared doesn't mean you stop trying. It just means you have to be braver." They stood there together as the night deepened around them, a family caught between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between the warmth of this moment and the cold weight of crowns not yet worn. Outside, London slept and woke and went about its business, unaware that in this room, a new generation was learning the same hard lessons their ancestors had learned, but perhaps, hopefully, with a little more gentleness, a little more permission to be human. When they finally said goodnight and returned to their own room, Kate and William didn't speak for a long time. They simply held each other in the darkness, drawing strength from the solid reality of each other, from the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it the way they'd promised, together. And somewhere, perhaps, Elizabeth smiled at what she'd set in motion, not a revolution, but an evolution. Not a breaking of tradition, but a bending of it towards something that might, eventually, allow her descendants to be both royal and real, both dutiful and loved. The letter had changed everything. But perhaps, in the end, that was exactly what she'd intended. The press briefing room at Buckingham Palace had hosted countless announcements over the decades, births and deaths, marriages and divorces, the slow turning of the royal wheel that the public watched with endless fascination. But today felt different. The assembled journalists sensed it, their collective energy crackling with anticipation as the palace's communications secretary stepped to the podium. The statement was brief, clinical in its precision. Excerpts from Her Late Majesty's letter would be released carefully curated, respectfully edited, but unmistakable in their meaning. Camilla would be known as Queen Consort, without qualification or hesitation, as per Elizabeth's explicit wishes expressed in writing before her death. The reaction was instantaneous and cacophonous. At Kensington Palace, William and Kate watched the coverage unfold across multiple screens: BBC, Sky News, CNN, each channel offering its own interpretation of the bombshell. Some anchors spoke with reverent tones about Elizabeth's posthumous blessing, about the grace of forgiveness extended beyond the grave. Others were less kind, their voices sharp with skepticism, framing it as revisionist history, a convenient absolution that couldn't be questioned, because the woman who'd written it could no longer be challenged. Social media exploded in real time, the ticker at the bottom of the screen scrolling through reactions that ranged from deeply moved to openly hostile. Number Queen Camilla trended alongside number Not My Queen. Photographs of Diana appeared everywhere, as they always did when Camilla entered the conversation. A ghost summoned to bear witness against the living. William paced the length of their sitting room, his movements tight and controlled, but barely containing the agitation beneath. Kate remained still on the sofa, her legs tucked beneath her, watching both the screens and her husband with equal attention. Upstairs, the children slept, blissfully unaware that their family was once again being dissected by millions of strangers who felt entitled to opinions about relationships they'd never witnessed, sacrifices they couldn't begin to understand. "I knew it would be divisive," William said, his voice low. "But this," he gestured at the screen, where a particularly vitriolic tweet was being read aloud. "They're acting like my grandmother betrayed them. Like she wasn't allowed to change her mind, to evolve, to recognize that maybe she'd been wrong." "Your grandmother knew this would happen," Kate said quietly. "That's why she waited. She gave your father the shield of her words." Now when people criticize Camilla, they're also criticizing Elizabeth's judgment, her final wishes. It makes it harder to sustain the outrage. It doesn't feel harder. William stopped at the window, his reflection ghostly in the darkened glass. "It feels exactly the same. My father's choice being questioned, Camilla being punished for the crime of being loved by the wrong person at the wrong time." Kate's phone buzzed on the table between them. She glanced at the screen, then looked up at William. "It's Camilla." William took the phone, his jaw tight. Camilla. Her voice, when it came, was smaller than he'd ever heard it. Shaken. "William, I can't do this. The things they're saying. I think perhaps it's better if I simply remain as Duchess. Your father will understand. We've managed this long. Without the title, we can manage." "No." The word came out sharper than he'd intended. William drew a breath, softened his tone, but not his conviction. "No, Camilla. You don't get to refuse this. But the damage—" "My grandmother didn't write that letter for you to hide from it," William interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "She wrote it so you could finally stop apologizing for existing. She gave you permission to stand beside my father as his equal, and you don't get to throw that away because some people can't let go of their anger." Silence on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, "She never said it to my face. In all those years, she never once indicated, 'I know,' and I think she regretted that. I think that's why she wrote it down. Made sure we'd find it. Made sure the world would know. She was protecting you the only way she knew how, from beyond the grave, where no one could argue with her or diminish what she'd decided." "I'm afraid," Camilla whispered. "I'm afraid of failing your father, of making things harder for him." "Then stand beside him," William said simply. "Be his queen. That's all he's ever wanted, not for you to be perfect, just for you to be there." When he ended the call, Kate had moved to stand beside him. She said nothing, simply took his hand, and they stood together watching the city lights blur through glass that reflected their own uncertain faces back at them. Past midnight, William drove alone to Windsor Castle. The roads were empty, the city sleeping, and in the silence of the car, he felt the weight of everything pressing down: his grandmother's letter, his father's fear, Camilla's fragility, George's two old eyes asking questions that had no easy answers. Street. George's chapel rose before him in darkness, its Gothic spires reaching toward a sky scattered with stars. The security detail let him pass without comment. They were used to these late-night visits, these private moments when duty could be temporarily set aside for grief. Inside, the chapel was dim, illuminated only by the perpetual candle that burned near the altar and the handful of votive lights left by visitors paying their respects. His footsteps echoed on stone that had witnessed centuries of royal worship, royal weddings, royal farewells. His grandmother's tomb lay in a side chapel, simple and elegant, inscribed with her name and dates that bracketed a lifetime of service. William stood before it, and the words came unbidden, spoken aloud to the silence and to the woman who rested beneath the marble. "You always knew, didn't you, that we'd need this, that I'd need this?" He thought of her final months, the careful way she'd orchestrated every detail of her exit from the world stage, nothing left to chance, nothing forgotten. Even this, especially this, had been planned, timed, designed to provide maximum protection for the people she loved but couldn't quite embrace while she lived. "I used to think you were cold, William," continued, his voice breaking slightly, "that you chose duty over love every time, without hesitation. But maybe you were just afraid. Afraid that if you let yourself love too openly, want too desperately, the institution would crumble. Maybe you were protecting all of us, the only way you knew how." He thought of Kate, of the years they'd dated before marrying, the scrutiny she'd endured, the questions about whether a commoner could ever truly be royal enough. His grandmother had watched all of it with apparent neutrality, but she'd never interfered, never forbidden. Silent permission, perhaps. Or just exhaustion from fighting battles she knew couldn't be won. The letter wasn't just about Camilla, was it? William realized aloud. It was about forgiveness. Of her, yes, but also of Father, and maybe of yourself. For all the times you chose duty and wondered if you'd chosen wrong, the tears came then, hot and unexpected, years of grief and confusion, and love for this complicated woman who'd shaped his life in ways both beautiful and brutal. He cried for her isolation, for her strength, for the loneliness of a crown worn for 70 years without being allowed to set it down, not even for a moment. When the tears finally subsided, William reached into his pocket and withdrew a single white rose, her favorite, carefully preserved. He placed it gently on the tomb, his fingers lingering on the cold marble. "Thank you," he whispered, "for teaching us, for protecting us, for finally giving us permission to be human." The chapel was silent. But in that silence, William felt something shift, not resolution, but acceptance. Not answers, but peace with the questions. The following weekend brought unexpected sunshine, and with it, a gathering at Kensington Palace that felt almost defiantly normal. Charles and Camilla arrived mid-morning, not in the official car with its flags and protocol, but in Charles's personal vehicle, a beat-up Land Rover that had seen better days and seemed incongruous with his position as king. The children descended upon them immediately, Louis dragging Charles toward the garden to show him something urgent involving worms, Charlotte presenting Camilla with a drawing she'd made, George hanging back but smiling in that reserved way that meant he was genuinely pleased. Inside, Kate and Camilla worked side by side in the kitchen, setting the table for lunch. It was a task that could have been done by staff, should have been done by staff according to protocol, but they dismissed everyone with firm politeness. This was family. This was theirs. "Thank you," Camilla said quietly, arranging napkins with careful precision. "For everything. For William's words the other night. For this." She gestured around the kitchen, at the normalcy of it. Kate looked up from the salad she was preparing. "You've earned your place. But more than that, you've earned your peace." Camilla's hands stilled. "I wish she'd told me, herself, the Queen. I wish she'd said it to my face, just once." "Maybe she couldn't," Kate said gently. "Maybe it took losing everything, her life, her reign, her ability to control the narrative, for her to find the courage to say it at all. But she found a way. In the end, she found a way." Through the kitchen window, William watched the scene in the garden, his father kneeling in the dirt beside Louis, their heads bent together, as Charles explained something about bulbs and seasons and patience. It was such an ordinary moment, so completely divorced from crowns and titles and public opinion, and it filled William with a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. Charles appeared beside him, brushing dirt from his hands. "Your mother would have hated this, you know. The mess. The noise." William glanced at his father, saw the complicated grief in his eyes, love for Diana, coexisting with love for Camilla, never resolved, always aching. Maybe, William said, gently. But she'd have understood it, eventually. Just like Granny did. You think so? I think everyone deserves the chance to change their mind. To grow. To learn that love doesn't diminish. When it's shared, it multiplies. They called everyone inside for lunch. And the dining room filled with noise. Louis talking over everyone. Charlotte singing snatches of a song she'd learned at school. George asking Charles earnest questions about environmental policy that Charles answered with touching seriousness. Camilla laughed at something Kate said, her face more open than William had ever seen it. And at the head of the table, his father watched his family with an expression that could only be called wonder. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was real messy and loud and full of the complicated, beautiful chaos of people trying to love each other despite the weight of history and expectation and a world watching their every move. And somewhere, William thought, his grandmother was smiling at what she'd set in motion, not a revolution, but an evolution. Permission, finally, to be both royal and human, both dutiful and loved. 6 months had passed since the letter's discovery, and Windsor Castle hummed with the controlled chaos of final preparations. The coronation loomed just days away, and every room seemed filled with people moving with urgent purpose, military officers consulting clipboards, clergy rehearsing their parts in hushed Latin, seamstresses making last-minute adjustments to robes that weighed as much as history itself. William and Kate stood in the state apartments, watching the choreography unfold. Every step had been measured, every gesture prescribed by centuries of tradition. The Earl Marshal barked instructions to a regiment of pages and attendants, his voice echoing off vaulted ceilings that had witnessed coronations stretching back through time. In a side room, George stood on a fitting platform, while a tailor pinned the final adjustments to his page uniform. The crimson velvet was heavy, designed for a much older boy, and George's thin shoulders seemed to struggle under its weight. His face was pale, his jaw set in that way that meant he was fighting to maintain composure. William caught sight of his son through the doorway and felt his chest tighten. He'd been so focused on his father's coronation, on Camilla's elevation, on managing the public narrative, that he'd failed to fully register what this moment meant for George, his first major public ceremony. Performing a role before billions of watching eyes, carrying the weight of his future on 11-year-old shoulders, he excused himself from the rehearsal and slipped into the fitting room. The tailor stepped back respectfully, sensing this was a private moment. "How are you doing?" William asked, his voice gentle. George didn't answer immediately. His fingers plucked at the velvet of his uniform, pulling at invisible threads. "What if I mess up?" he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I trip, or drop something, or forget what I'm supposed to do? Everyone will be watching. The whole world." William's heart broke a little. He knelt beside the platform so he was at eye level with his son, their faces aligned in a way that erased the difference in their ages, made them simply two people sharing a fear. "Great-Granny left us more than a letter," William said. "She left us a reminder that the crown doesn't make us perfect. It just asks us to try, that's all. Just try your best, and that's enough. But what if my best isn't good enough? Then you try again the next time, and the time after that." That's what she did. That's what Grandpa is doing. That's what I'll do when it's my turn. William reached up and gently straightened George's collar. "Did she ever get scared, Great-Granny?" George's eyes widened slightly. "Did she?" "Every single day," William said with quiet certainty. "But she showed up anyway. That's what courage is, George. It's not the absence of fear. It's showing up, even when you're terrified." From the doorway, Kate watched with tears blurring her vision. She saw her husband kneeling before their son, saw the way George's small hand reached out to grip William's shoulder, saw the moment when fear transformed not into confidence, exactly, but into determination. George straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and in that subtle shift of posture, Kate glimpsed the man he would become, the king he might one day be. "Okay," George said, his voice stronger now. "Okay, I can do this." "I know you can," William replied, "and we'll be right there." "You're not doing this alone." George nodded, and something in his eyes settled. Not peace, perhaps, but acceptance. The tailor returned to finish his work, and William rejoined Kate in the doorway. She slipped her hand into his, squeezed once, and together they watched their son stand a little taller under the weight of crimson velvet and expectation. Kensington Palace was silent in the deep hours of night, but William's mind refused to quiet. He lay awake beside Kate, listening to her steady breathing, counting the minutes until dawn would break and the day the coronation day would begin in earnest. Finally, unable to bear the stillness any longer, he rose and padded barefoot to his study. The room was dark, except for the amber glow of a single lamp he switched on. Shadows gathered in the corners, familiar and comforting. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that he needed something. Connection, perhaps. Reassurance. A reminder that others had walked this path before him and survived it. On a shelf behind his desk sat an old wooden box he hadn't opened in years. Letters from his grandmother, accumulated over a lifetime. Birthday messages, notes of encouragement before exams, condolences after his mother's death. He'd kept them all, unable to discard even the most mundane, as if each one was a lifeline to a woman he'd loved fiercely, but never quite understood. He pulled the box down and began sorting through the envelopes, his fingers recognizing the texture of her stationery before his eyes registered the dates. And then he found it, a letter dated September 1997, just weeks after Diana's funeral, when the world had seemed to end, and then, impossibly, continued. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper and began to read aloud, his voice barely more than a whisper in the quiet room. "My dear William, you are stronger than you know. One day you will understand that love and duty are not enemies. They are the same thing, worn differently. When that day comes, you will be ready. All my love, Granny." The words hit him with unexpected force. He'd read this letter many times as a teenager, searching for comfort in ink and paper, but he'd never fully grasped what she was trying to tell him. Now, decades later, standing on the precipice of his father's coronation and his own future kingship, the message crystallized into clarity. She'd known. Even then, grieving her daughter-in-law while trying to hold a fragmenting family together, she'd known that one day he would face this exact dilemma: how to be both human and royal, how to love deeply while serving dutifully, how to reconcile the impossible contradictions that came with the crown. William closed the letter carefully and looked at the photograph on his desk, his grandmother at her own coronation, young and radiant and impossibly remote. But now he saw past the formal pose to the woman beneath, the one who'd written letters to a grieving boy, who'd left instructions for a son she'd never quite managed to embrace publicly, who'd spent 70 years learning lessons she'd tried to pass on in whatever way she could. "Come to bed." He turned to find Kate in the doorway, wrapped in a robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked soft and real, in a way that anchored him, pulled him back from the past into the present. "Tomorrow is theirs," she said gently, "but tonight is ours." William set the letter back in its box, switched off the lamp, and crossed to her. She took his hand, and together they walked up the darkened stairs, leaving the study and its ghosts behind. Tomorrow would bring ceremony and spectacle, the weight of history and the glare of cameras. But tonight, for these few remaining hours, they were simply William and Kate, finding comfort in the familiar warmth of their bed, in each other's steady presence, in the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. Westminster Abbey rose before them in the gray morning light, ancient and imposing, its Gothic spires piercing the sky like prayers made stone. The streets surrounding it were packed with crowds who'd gathered before dawn, waving flags and holding up phones to capture moments they could share with the world. The air vibrated with anticipation, trumpets and timpani, warming up inside. The distant roar of helicopters circling overhead. The collective breath of millions, watching from every corner of the globe. The family arrived in procession, first William and Kate with the children, then Charles and Camilla in the Golden State coach, its ornate magnificence somehow both magnificent and absurd, a relic from another age, pressed into service for this ancient ritual. As they gathered at the Abbey's entrance, William felt the familiar weight of ceremony settle over him like a cloak. George stood beside him in his page uniform, no longer visibly anxious but focused, his young face set with determination. Charlotte clutched Kate's hand, her eyes wide with wonder. Louis fidgeted with his collar, until Kate stilled him with a gentle touch. And then there was Camilla, resplendent in ivory and gold, her face composed but pale. As she reached the threshold of the Abbey, that symbolic boundary between the outside world and the sacred space within, she hesitated. Just for a moment, her step faltered, and William saw in her eyes the accumulated weight of decades of doubt, of being unwanted, of waiting for permission that had never quite come. Charles was beside her instantly. He took her hand and leaned close, whispering something only she could hear. William couldn't make out the words, but he saw the effect. Camilla's face softened, a smile blooming small but genuine across her lips. She squeezed Charles's hand, nodded once, and together they stepped forward into the Abbey. The organ swelled, a sound so massive it seemed to shake the very stones of the building. The congregation rose as one, thousands of faces turning toward the procession. William and Kate took their seats with the children, George positioned between them as a living bridge between past and future. George leaned close to his father and whispered, "Is she really going to be queen now?" William looked down at his son, saw the genuine curiosity in his eyes. Not judgment, not resistance. Just a child trying to understand the world being reshaped around him. "Yes," William said quietly. "Really?" George considered this, his gaze drifting to where Camilla and Charles were processing down the aisle, moving toward the throne and the crown and the impossible weight of it all. Then he nodded, decisive and certain in the way only children could be when they'd made up their minds about something. "Good," George said simply. The ceremony unfolded with the practiced precision of something that had been performed countless times over countless centuries. The Archbishop's voice rose and fell in ancient cadences, prayers offered in Latin and English, oaths sworn with hands on Bibles that had witnessed the promises of monarchs stretching back through time. And then came the moment the crown lifted high, catching the light that streamed through stained glass windows, transforming into something almost otherworldly. The Abbey fell silent, the congregation holding its collective breath. The Archbishop lowered the crown onto Camilla's head, and in that instant, she was no longer the Duchess, no longer the other woman, no longer provisional or temporary or tolerated. She was queen. William felt Kate's hand find his, their fingers intertwining as they witnessed this transformation. Across the Abbey, he could see his father's face radiant with pride and love and relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. And beside Charles, Camilla sat with the crown upon her head, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall, her spine straight with a dignity earned through decades of endurance. "Granny, wherever you are, we heard you, and we'll keep listening." The thought came unbidden, but felt like truth. Elizabeth had set this in motion, had given them permission to evolve, to grow, to become something more than the sum of their duties. And now, sitting in this Abbey, surrounded by history and ceremony and the weight of expectation, William felt something shift, not resolution, but possibility. The future was still unwritten, still uncertain, but they were facing it together. The organ erupted in glorious sound, and the congregation's voices rose in song, Zadok the priest, the same anthem that had been sung at every coronation, since 1727. Connecting this moment to all the moments that had come before. The abbey filled with music and light, and the sound of thousands singing as one. And there in the front row, 4 figures stood together. Charles and Camilla, crowned and radiant. William and Kate, their hands clasped, their children between them. Not perfect, not unburdened, but together, facing forward, stepping into a future that held both the weight of history and the lightness of permission to be finally both royal and human. The music swelled, the light poured through ancient glass, and somewhere beyond sight, Elizabeth smiled at what she'd set in motion. Love and duty, no longer enemies, but the same thing worn differently, together.